There is a particular kind of tired that has nothing to do with how much sleep you got last night. It is the tiredness of a person who has spent years holding a version of themselves together for everyone else to see, while the real one waits quietly somewhere underneath, uncared for, unspoken to, unvisited for so long that it has almost stopped expecting a visit at all. If you know that tiredness, you are in the right place tonight. Not to fix it, not to solve it before you sleep, only to let it be seen for a little while, gently, without anyone asking you to explain it. Tonight we are going to sit with two things that seem like opposites, but are really the same thing wearing different clothes. Self-love and letting go. You have probably heard both phrases so many times that they have started to sound like noise, like something printed on a mug, like advice that sounds lovely and means nothing when you are actually lying awake at 2 a.m, wondering why you keep abandoning yourself for people who are never going to stay. So we are not going to talk about self-love as decoration tonight. We are going to talk about it as a practice of return. And we are not going to talk about letting go as giving up. We are going to talk about it as the moment you finally stop gripping a life that was never yours to hold so tightly. You do not have to do anything right now except let your body settle. Let your shoulders drop an inch from where they have been sitting all day without you noticing. Let your jaw unclench. Most people carry the whole day in their jaw and their shoulders and never once think to ask those places how they are doing. So ask now, quietly, without words. And let them answer by softening, even slightly, even just for tonight. There is an old idea, one that shows up again and again across the history of depth psychology, that a person is not simply born whole and then kept whole by good luck. A person is born whole and then slowly, piece by piece, taught to abandon parts of that wholeness in exchange for love, for safety, for belonging in a family, or a room, or a culture that could only tolerate certain parts of them. The quiet child learns that stillness is what earns affection, so the loud, curious part goes into hiding. The angry child learns that anger frightens the people they depend on, so the anger goes underground and waits. The sensitive child learns that tears embarrass the adults around them, so the sensitivity gets folded up small and tucked away where no one can trip over it again. And what is left standing in the light is a carefully edited person, a person built for approval rather than for truth. This editing does not feel like loss while it is happening. It feels like growing up. It feels like becoming easier to love. And in a sense, it is exactly that, except the love it earns is love for the edited version, not love for the whole person. And some quiet part of you has always known the difference, even if you never had the words for it. That knowing is what keeps you up some nights. That small ache that has nothing to do with any one event, and everything to do with the slow accumulation of all the times you made yourself smaller so someone else could stay comfortable. Self-love, in its deepest and least decorative sense, is the long work of finding that original, unedited person again. Not inventing someone new and improved, finding the one who is always there, underneath the performance, underneath the good behavior, underneath the careful management of everyone else's comfort. And letting go, in its truest sense, is not about releasing people or outcomes, although it often looks like that on the surface. It is about releasing your grip on the edited version of yourself, the one you built to survive, so the real one finally has room to breathe. Tonight, I want to walk with you through several turns of this same truth, several different angles on the same quiet room, because no single explanation ever really lands the way that circling something slowly and patiently does. You do not need to remember any of it by morning. You only need to let it move through you tonight, the way water moves through soil it has never touched before, finding the cracks, filling the spaces that have been dry for a very long time. Before we begin, I want to name something that is easy to miss, because it hides in plain sight inside almost every conversation about self-love. Loving yourself was never supposed to be a solitary achievement, something you accomplish alone in a locked room and then present to the world, finished and gleaming, as proof of your own evolution. It was always meant to be closer to a relationship, ongoing and imperfect, the way any relationship worth having is ongoing and imperfect. You do not master a relationship with another person once and then never have to attend to it again. You keep showing up, keep noticing when distance has crept in, keep repairing what needs repairing, again and again, for as long as the relationship matters to you. The relationship with yourself works exactly the same way, and expecting it to resolve permanently after one insight, one realization, one particularly moving night like this one, sets you up for a disappointment that has nothing to do with your own capacity for growth, and everything to do with a misunderstanding about what growth actually looks like. So if you find, in the weeks after tonight, that old patterns return, that you catch yourself gripping again, performing again, abandoning yourself again in some small, quiet way, let that be met with the same gentleness we are about to practice here, rather than treat it as proof that none of this worked. It worked. It is simply that love, of any kind, toward any person, including yourself, is not a single door you walk through once. It is a doorway you walk through again and again, sometimes many times in a single day. And each time you walk through it, however many times you have needed to before, counts exactly as much as the first time did. The first turn is this: you cannot love a person you have never allowed yourself to meet. And for many of us, the self is exactly that, a stranger. We know our job titles, we know our habits, our preferences, the shows we watch to numb out, the small rituals we perform to get through a day. But if you asked us, honestly, without the resume and without the roles, who are you underneath all of that? A long silence would follow. Not because there is nothing there, because no one has ever asked, including us. Think about how much of your life has been organized around being known by other people. Your parents needed to know you as obedient or as talented or as easy. Your partners needed to know you as understanding, as low maintenance, as someone who would not ask for too much. Your friends needed to know you as reliable, as fun, as the one who shows up. Your job needs to know you as competent, as calm under pressure, as someone who does not bring their feelings into the room. Every one of these roles required you to present a particular slice of yourself and quietly withhold the rest. And over enough years, the withheld parts stop knocking. They assume no one is coming for them anymore. They go still in the dark, waiting for a visitor who never seems to arrive. Self-love begins in the strange and almost embarrassing act of finally going looking for them. Not with a plan, not with an agenda to fix or improve what you find, just with the willingness to sit in the quiet and ask, without flinching away from the answer, what is actually here? What have I been carrying that no one else can see? What have I been afraid to feel because feeling it seemed like it would be too much for the people around me to hold? This is not selfish. It only looks selfish to a mind that has been trained to believe attention paid to yourself is attention stolen from someone else. But you cannot pour from a self you have never located. You cannot give love from a place you have abandoned. The well has to be found before it can be filled, and it has to be filled before anything can be drawn from it without leaving you emptier than before. There was a woman, unremarkable in every outward way, who spent almost 2 decades being described by everyone who knew her as easygoing. It was the word that followed her everywhere. Easygoing. She never made a fuss. She never inconvenienced anyone with a preference too strongly held. When people asked where she wanted to eat, she said anywhere is fine. When plans changed at the last minute, she said no worries at all. And for a long time, she believed this was simply her personality, the shape she had always been. It was only much later, in a season of her life when everything slowed down enough for her to actually listen to herself, that she realized something uncomfortable. She did not know what she wanted anymore. Not for dinner, not for her weekends, not for her own life. Somewhere along the way, in the process of becoming easy for everyone else, she had lost the thread that connected her to her own preferences entirely. She had to relearn, slowly and with real effort, what it felt like to want something and say so out loud without apologizing for it first. This is what self-love actually looks like in its early stages, and it is far less glamorous than the phrase suggests. It is not candles and bubble baths, although there is nothing wrong with either of those things. It is the uncomfortable, almost clumsy process of asking yourself small questions you have not asked in years, and sitting with the strange sensation of not immediately knowing the answers. What do I actually think about this? What do I actually feel right now, underneath the reflex to say I'm fine? What would I choose here if no one were watching and no one would be disappointed by my choice? These questions feel small, but they are the beginning of everything, because they are the first steps back into a house you left standing empty for a very long time. Just let yourself rest here for a moment. You do not have to answer any of those questions tonight. You only have to notice that they exist, that there is a version of you underneath the performance who has opinions and longings and preferences of her own, of his own, and that version has been waiting, patiently, without resentment, for you to come home. Think of a house that has been left standing empty for years, not because it is unlivable, but because whoever left it simply never came back. The furniture is still there, dusty but intact. The windows are still whole. Nothing has actually been destroyed, only unattended. And when someone finally does return, years later, to open the door and walk through the rooms again, there is no anger waiting in that house. Only stillness, and a faint smell of disuse, and a quiet readiness to be lived in again the moment someone decides to stay. This is closer to what the abandoned self is actually like than the more dramatic language of brokenness that gets used so often. You were not shattered, you were simply left. And leaving can be undone far more gently than shattering ever could. So tonight, if you find yourself unsure what you actually feel about your own life, do not treat that uncertainty as a failure. Treat it the way you would treat walking into a house after a long absence, a little unfamiliar, a little dusty, but entirely capable of being opened up again, room by room, at whatever pace feels bearable. You do not have to clean the whole house in one night. You only have to open the front door and let a little air move through it. That is enough for tonight. That is enough to begin. The second turn is this. So much of what looks like love, from the outside and even from the inside, is actually a search for rescue. And a person cannot build a stable love, for themselves or for anyone else, from a foundation of searching to be rescued. Consider how often love gets confused with relief. You meet someone, and the anxious hum that has been running underneath your life for as long as you can remember goes quiet for the first time in months, and you call that feeling love because it is powerful and it is sudden, and it changes the way the air feels in your lungs. But relief is not the same as love. Relief is what happens when a wound that has been throbbing finally gets pressure applied to it. It feels enormous. It feels like the answer. But pressure is not healing. Pressure is only pressure. And the moment it is removed, the wound is exactly as it was, sometimes worse, because now it has tasted what quiet feels like and cannot bear to lose it again. This is why so many people find themselves choosing, again and again, partners and friendships and situations that ultimately leave them feeling smaller rather than larger. It is not because they enjoy suffering. It is because the part of them still searching for rescue recognizes something familiar in the shape of the person offering it, even when what is familiar is actually old pain wearing a new face. The nervous system does not chase happiness in any straightforward way. It chases the familiar, because the familiar, however painful, has at least been survived before. New love that asks nothing of your old wounds can feel, strangely, like nothing at all. Love that reopens the old wound, that requires the same anxious effort you learned as a child to be worthy of attention, can feel like the realest thing you have ever known, precisely because it is so recognizable. Letting go in this context does not mean giving up on love. It means giving up the specific project of being rescued by it. It means noticing, honestly and without shame, when you are asking another person to do work that only you can do for yourself. The work of telling you that you are enough. The work of proving, through their consistency, that you are worth staying for. No relationship can bear that weight forever, no matter how loving the other person is, because the question was never actually about them. It was about a much older and much quieter question you have been asking since long before you knew their name. It is worth pausing here to say clearly that none of this is about blame. The part of you that goes looking for rescue did not choose that pattern out of weakness or poor judgment. It learned, very early, in circumstances you did not choose and could not have changed, that love had to be earned, chased, or won, rather than simply received. A child who grows up with a caregiver whose attention comes and goes unpredictably does not conclude, rationally, that the caregiver is inconsistent. Children do not think in those terms. They conclude instead that they themselves must be responsible for the inconsistency, that if they could only be good enough, quiet enough, impressive enough, the attention would finally stay. And that conclusion, formed so young, becomes a kind of blueprint that gets carried, largely unexamined, into every close relationship that follows, including the one you are currently in, if you are in one, and including the one you will eventually find yourself in, if you are not. Recognizing this blueprint is not the same as being cured of it, but it is the necessary first step because you cannot change a pattern you cannot see. And for most people, this particular pattern operates entirely below the surface, disguised as simply the way love feels. It feels like anxiety, like performance, like a low hum of not quite enough. And because it has felt that way for as long as they can remember, they assume that is simply what love is supposed to feel like. It is one of the more disorienting realizations a person can have, discovering that love is allowed to feel calm, that it does not have to ache in order to be real, that the absence of anxiety is not the absence of depth, but very often the presence of something far more durable than anxiety ever was. There was a man who came to understand this only after his third relationship ended in almost the exact same way as the first two. Different women, different cities, different circumstances, and yet somehow the ending always arrived at the same place, with him feeling abandoned and confused about how, once again, he had chosen someone who eventually pulled away. It took him a long time to see the pattern from above, rather than from inside it. He was not choosing people who were incapable of loving him. He was choosing people whose particular way of loving required him to keep performing, keep proving, keep earning, in exactly the way he had learned to perform for a parent whose attention had always felt slightly out of reach. He was not falling in love with these women. He was reenacting an old scene, hoping that this time, if he just tried hard enough, when he finally slowed down enough to see this, the shift that followed was not dramatic. He did not swear off relationships or transform overnight into someone entirely new. He simply began asking himself a different question before he let himself fall for someone. Not, will this person choose me if I am good enough? But, does this person's presence feel like rest, or does it feel like an audition? That single question changed the entire trajectory of who he allowed close to him, because it moved the center of gravity from proving his worth to simply noticing whether he felt safe enough to exist without proving anything at all. Just breathe here for a moment. If any part of what I have just said feels uncomfortably familiar, that discomfort is not a failure. It is information. It is the sound of something old finally being named instead of quietly repeated. There is a difference worth sitting with tonight between wanting someone and needing them to complete a sentence you never finished writing about yourself. Wanting comes from a place of fullness reaching outward, the way a tree does not need the sun in order to exist, but grows more fully, more richly, when the sun is present. Needing, of the kind we are talking about tonight, comes from a place of absence reaching outward, hoping that someone else's presence will fill a hole that presence alone was never designed to fill. You can tell the difference, if you are honest with yourself, by asking a simple question after any relationship ends or any person pulls away. Do I feel grief, the clean and painful kind that comes from losing something real? Or do I feel a kind of panic, a sense that some part of me cannot survive without them, a sense that the ground itself has disappeared? Grief is love meeting loss. Panic is often need meeting the terror of being alone with yourself again, which is a very different and much older kind of pain, one that started long before this particular person ever entered your life. Neither of these responses makes you broken, but only one of them can actually be healed by finding a different person to love. The other one requires something no relationship can ever provide, which is the slow, patient work of learning to be with yourself without abandoning yourself in the process. That work does not happen instantly, and it does not happen because you finally meet someone wonderful enough to make you feel safe. It happens because you finally decide, quietly, on your own, without anyone's permission, that you are allowed to be safe with yourself first. The third turn is this. Letting go is not the opposite of caring. It is the opposite of gripping, and almost everyone confuses the two. We are taught, in ways so subtle we rarely notice them being taught, that holding on tightly is proof of love. The parent who cannot let their grown child make a single decision without input believes they are showing devotion. The partner who checks in 6 times a day, who needs to know exactly where the other person is and exactly what they are feeling at all times, believes they are showing commitment. The friend who cannot bear to see someone they love struggle without immediately offering solutions, without needing to fix it right now, believes they are showing care. And in each case, what actually happens is something quite different from care. It is control dressed in the language of concern. Real care does not need to grip in order to remain real. A river does not need to hold on to the water flowing through it in order to remain a river. In fact, the moment it tried to hold on, to dam itself up, and refuse to let the water pass through and onward, it would stop being a river at all. It would become a stagnant pool, still and increasingly lifeless, mistaking its stillness for permanence, when really it is only decay moving slowly. Love that grips too tightly suffers the same fate. It believes that holding on is what keeps it alive, when in truth, the holding on is exactly what suffocates it. This is a difficult truth to sit with, because gripping so often comes from a real and legitimate fear, the fear of loss, the fear that if you loosen your hand even slightly, everything you have built will slip away and prove that it was never solid to begin with. But here is what is strange about that fear when you look at it closely. The tighter the grip, the more likely the loss actually becomes, because nothing living can breathe inside a closed fist. Not a plant, not a bird, not another person's freedom to choose you again tomorrow the way they chose you today. The grip does not prevent the loss it is afraid of. It manufactures it, slowly, through the very tightness that was meant to prevent it. Letting go, then, is not a betrayal of love. It is love's actual expression, once you strip away the fear that has been disguising itself as devotion. It says, I care about you enough to let you be free, including free to leave, because a love that exists only under threat of loss was never really love in the first place. It was a hostage situation with better lighting. There was a mother who spent years believing that her constant involvement in her daughter's every decision was proof of how deeply she loved her. She read every text before it was sent, questioned every friendship, steered every choice about school and clothing and free time with an intensity she called guidance, and her daughter, silently, came to experience as suffocation. It was only when her daughter, as a young adult, finally created real distance between them, painful and necessary distance, that the mother was forced to confront what her gripping had actually been protecting. Not her daughter's well-being, her own fear of being irrelevant, of not being needed, of facing a version of herself that existed apart from the role of protector. Letting go for her did not mean loving her daughter less. It meant, slowly and with real grief, learning to love her without needing to control the shape her life took. And strangely, the relationship that eventually grew back between them, once the grip finally loosened, was closer and more honest than anything the control had ever produced. Just rest here. You do not have to release everything you are holding on to tonight. You only have to notice, honestly, where your hands have been closed so tightly for so long that you forgot they were ever meant to open. There is a simple experiment worth trying sometime, not tonight, but someday when you remember it. Close your hand into a fist as tightly as you can and hold it there for a full minute. Notice how quickly the effort becomes uncomfortable, how the muscles begin to ache, how the hand itself starts to feel less like a hand and more like a clenched, useless thing, incapable of holding anything new, even if something wonderful were offered to it in that moment. Then let it open, slowly, and notice the relief that floods in almost immediately, not because anything outside of you has changed, but because the hand itself has simply stopped fighting its own nature. Hands were built to open and close, to hold and release, to receive and to let go, in a constant and healthy rhythm. A hand that only ever closes is not stronger for it. It is simply exhausted, and eventually, incapable of holding anything at all. Your grip on people, on outcomes, on old identities, on the way you believe your life is supposed to look, works exactly the same way. The tighter and longer you hold, the less capable you become of actually receiving anything new, because every part of you is occupied with the effort of not letting go. Letting go, then, is not the loss of strength. It is the return of it, the restoration of a hand finally capable of holding something gently instead of desperately, which is the only way anything has ever truly been held for long. The fourth turn is this. Much of what we call self-improvement is actually self-rejection wearing a productive costume. And no amount of self-improvement built on that foundation will ever feel like enough, because it was never designed to arrive anywhere. It was designed to keep moving the target forever, just out of reach. Think about how many of your daily habits, if you are honest, are rooted not in love for yourself, but in a quiet, constant dissatisfaction with who you currently are. The exercise that is less about caring for your body and more about punishing it into a shape you have decided is acceptable. The relentless self-monitoring, the calorie counting and habit tracking and constant optimization, That promises peace at the end of some imagined finish line, but somehow never actually delivers it, because as soon as one goal is met, a new deficiency is discovered to replace it. This is not self-love. This is self-rejection with a very good publicist. Real self-love does not require you to hate the current version of yourself in order to motivate change. In fact, it works in almost the opposite direction. Change that grows out of genuine care for yourself tends to be gentler, more sustainable, and stranger than change that grows out of self-hatred, because it is not trying to outrun anything. It is not trying to escape a version of you that is considered unacceptable. It is simply an expression of wanting to feel good in your own life, the way you might tend a garden, not because you despise the weeds, but because you love the garden. This distinction matters more than it might seem to at first. A person who exercises because they hate their body will eventually stop, because hatred is exhausting fuel and it runs out. A person who exercises because they love the feeling of strength in their own limbs will keep going long after the first person has quit, because love is a fuel that renews itself. The same is true of almost every area of change. Boundaries set from self-hatred, out of a desperate attempt to finally be taken seriously, tend to feel brittle and are easily abandoned the first time someone pushes back. Boundaries set from self-respect tend to hold, quietly and without drama, because they were never a performance in the first place. They were simply an accurate description of what you will and will not allow into your life. There was a young man who spent years chasing an idea of discipline that always seemed to be one habit away, one morning routine away, one more sacrifice away from finally making him feel like enough. He would build elaborate systems for himself, wake at dawn, avoid every indulgence, push his body to exhaustion, and for a while it would feel like progress, like he was finally becoming the person he was supposed to be. But the feeling never lasted, because underneath the discipline was still the same quiet belief that he was not currently acceptable, and no amount of achievement could ever fully answer a question that was never really about achievement in the first place. It was only when he began to ask a different question, not how do I become someone worth loving, but what would it look like to treat the person I already am as worth loving right now, that the compulsive striving finally began to loosen. He still worked hard, he still had ambitions, but the frantic, punishing edge slowly softened into something closer to care, and strangely, he found himself accomplishing more, not less, once the accomplishing stopped being an attempt to earn his own basic worth. Just breathe here. If you have spent years trying to fix your way into feeling acceptable, notice, gently, that the fixing was never actually going to arrive anywhere, because the target was never really the habit or the number or the achievement. It was always the belief underneath. And beliefs are not changed by achievement. They are changed by being met, finally, with something other than rejection. Consider for a moment how you would speak to a small child who was struggling to learn something new. You would not, if you were kind, stand over them listing every mistake, comparing them unfavorably to other children, warning them that failure meant they were fundamentally lacking. You would encourage them. You would notice small progress and name it out loud. You would let them stumble without treating the stumble as evidence of some permanent flaw in their character. Almost everyone knows, instinctively, how to offer this kind of patience to a child, and almost no one offers it to themselves. Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, the gentle voice that once encouraged a first wobbly attempt at walking got replaced with a much harsher one, a voice that treats every misstep as proof of inadequacy rather than simply part of being alive and still learning, which every one of us remains for our entire lives, no matter how old we get. Tonight, if only as an experiment, try offering yourself the voice you would offer that child. Not because you are fragile and need coddling, but because harshness has never actually produced lasting change in anyone, and gentleness, contrary to what you may have been taught, is not the same as weakness. It is simply a more accurate way of speaking to something that is still, always, in every stage of life, in the middle of learning how to be itself. The fifth turn is this: you are allowed to disappoint people. This sentence sounds small when you read it, but for many people it is one of the most difficult truths there is to actually live by, because somewhere very early in life, disappointing someone got confused with being unsafe. If you grew up in an environment where a caregiver's mood could shift the entire atmosphere of a home, where their disappointment felt dangerous rather than simply uncomfortable, you likely learned, without anyone ever explicitly teaching you, that keeping other people happy was not optional, it was survival. And that lesson, learned so young and so thoroughly, does not simply disappear once you grow up and leave that environment behind. It follows you into every room you enter for the rest of your life, whispering that any flicker of disappointment on another person's face is an emergency requiring your immediate response. This is exhausting in a way that is difficult to explain to someone who has never lived inside it. It means you are constantly scanning, constantly adjusting, constantly performing small acts of appeasement long before anyone has even asked you to. It means saying yes when your whole body is screaming no, because the discomfort of disappointing someone feels, in your nervous system, indistinguishable from actual danger, even though the rational part of your mind knows perfectly well that no one is going to be harmed by your honest answer. Self-love requires, at some point, the willingness to tolerate that discomfort without immediately fixing it. It requires letting someone be disappointed in you and staying in the room anyway, staying in your own skin anyway, without collapsing into apology or explanation or frantic repair. This does not mean becoming cold or indifferent to other people's feelings. It means recognizing that their disappointment is theirs to hold, and your job is not to manage every emotional weather system in every room you walk into. You were never actually responsible for that. You only believed you were, because once, a very long time ago, in a much smaller and more vulnerable version of yourself, it might genuinely have felt that way. There is a particular kind of freedom that opens up once you internalize this, slowly and imperfectly, over time. You start saying what you actually think in meetings, instead of the version you have pre-approved for safety. You start declining invitations you do not want to attend, instead of manufacturing an elaborate excuse. You start telling someone you love that something they did hurt you, even knowing they might respond with defensiveness or hurt feelings of their own, because you have finally understood that honesty offered with care is not cruelty, and their reaction to it, however it unfolds, is not yours to control or prevent. Letting go, in this turn of the same truth, means letting go of the fantasy that you can arrange your life so that no one is ever disappointed in you. That fantasy has a cost, and the cost is always paid out of your own authenticity, one small betrayal of yourself at a time, until eventually you look up and realize you have built an entire life out of managing other people's feelings and have almost none of your own left to manage. Just rest here for a moment. You do not have to fix this tonight. You only have to notice, honestly, how much of your life has been built around the fear of a look on someone's face, and how much room might open up if that fear were allowed to simply exist without dictating every choice you make. There is a quiet kind of courage in simply saying, "I understand you are disappointed," and staying present with that sentence instead of immediately following it with an apology you do not actually mean. Most of us were never taught that disappointment is a survivable weather system rather than an emergency requiring rescue. We were taught the opposite, often without a single word being spoken about it directly, just through the tension in a room whenever someone's expectations were not met. And so the body learned to treat mild disappointment the same way it treats real danger, flooding with the same urgency, the same need to fix things immediately, regardless of whether fixing them is actually possible or even appropriate. Retraining this takes practice, and it takes tolerating discomfort you have spent your whole life trying to avoid. But every time you let a small disappointment pass without rushing to repair it, without over-explaining or over-apologizing, you are teaching your own nervous system something new. You are teaching it that disappointment, someone else's included, is not the same as danger, and that you can remain standing, calm, and intact, even while someone nearby is unhappy with a choice you made. This lesson, learned slowly over many small moments, changes more about your life than almost anything else you could practice, because it is the foundation underneath every boundary you will ever need to set. The sixth turn is this: the parts of yourself you are most ashamed of are very often the same parts that once tried, in whatever limited way was available to a smaller and more powerless version of you, to keep you safe. It is easy to hate your own anger, your own neediness, your own tendency to shut down or lash out or disappear when things get overwhelming. It is easy to look at these traits as evidence of something broken in you, some flaw that needs to be corrected or hidden or apologized for. But almost none of these traits arrived randomly. Almost all of them were, at some point, intelligent responses to real circumstances. The anger that now embarrasses you may have once been the only voice loud enough to be heard in a house where quiet requests were routinely ignored. The neediness that now makes you cringe may have once been an accurate signal that your needs were, in fact, not being met. and a smaller version of you was simply trying, with the only tools available, to get them met. The shutting down that now frustrates the people who love you may have once been the only form of protection available when there was nowhere safe to run and no one available to help you feel your feelings. Self-love does not mean pretending these parts do not exist or forcing yourself to feel grateful for the pain that shaped them. It means approaching them with curiosity instead of contempt. It means, instead of asking, "Why am I like this?" asking, "What was this part of me trying to protect? And does it still need to work this hard now that circumstances have changed?" This shift from contempt to curiosity does not happen overnight, and it is not a single realization that fixes everything at once. It is a slow, repeated practice of catching yourself in the act of self-hatred and gently, without punishing yourself for the self-hatred either, redirecting towards something closer to compassion. This kind of curiosity is not the same as excusing harmful behavior or pretending that every reaction you have is justified simply because it once served a purpose. Understanding where a pattern came from is not the same as deciding it gets to run your life unchallenged forever. But there is an enormous difference between changing a pattern from a place of understanding and trying to force it into submission from a place of contempt. Contempt tends to produce shame, and shame, whatever else it does, has never once in the history of human psychology produced lasting, gentle change. It produces hiding. It produces the same old parts going further underground, working harder in secret, because now, in addition to whatever original wound they were protecting, they also have to protect themselves from your own inner hostility toward them. Understanding, by contrast, tends to produce something far more useful, which is trust. And a part of you that trusts you is far more willing to loosen its grip than a part of you that has learned it must fight you simply to survive. There was a woman who spent much of her adult life ashamed of how quickly she cried, how easily her feelings seemed to spill over in situations where other people appeared composed. She had internalized, somewhere along the way, the idea that this made her weak, that a stronger person would have more control. It was only in a season of real reflection that she began to understand her tears differently. As a child, tears had been the only language available to her that her family could not fully ignore. Words got dismissed, requests got overruled, but tears, at least sometimes, got a response. And so her body had learned, long before her mind understood why, that emotion needed to be expressed loudly and visibly in order to be taken seriously at all. As an adult, in situations where quieter forms of communication would have worked perfectly well, that old pattern still activated, because the nervous system does not automatically update itself just because circumstances have changed. Understanding this did not make her stop crying easily, but it changed her relationship to the crying entirely. Instead of shame, she began to feel something closer to tenderness toward the part of her that had learned, so young, to make sure she could not be ignored. Letting go, in this turn, means letting go of the war against your own history. It means allowing the parts of you that formed under pressure to be met with understanding rather than further pressure, because further pressure is simply more of what created the wound in the first place. You cannot punish a part of yourself into healing. You can only, slowly and patiently, offer it something it never received the first time around, which is simply being seen without judgment. Just breathe here for a moment. Whatever part of yourself you have been most ashamed of, whatever reaction or tendency you wish you could simply delete, let yourself consider, just for tonight, that it may have once been trying to help you, in the only way it knew how, and that trying, however imperfect, deserves something gentler than contempt. Imagine, for a moment, a guard who was posted at a door many years ago, when the house was young and genuinely under threat. The guard did their job well. They kept watch, they raised the alarm at the smallest sound. They never once let their attention slip, because the danger they were guarding against was real, and their vigilance mattered. But the house is different now. The threat that once justified round-the-clock watching has long since passed, and yet the guard is still there, still raising alarms at sounds that no longer mean what they used to mean, still treating every visitor as a potential danger, because no one ever came to tell them the situation had changed. This is what so many of your defenses are actually like. Not flaws, not evidence of brokenness, simply guards who were never properly relieved of duty, still working as hard as ever at a job that mostly no longer needs doing. Self-love, in this light, includes the strange and tender act of walking up to that guard and saying, gently, "Thank you. You can rest now. I am safe. You did your job and you did it well, and it is time to let someone else take the watch for a while. You cannot fire the guard with force. Force is the guard's own language, and meeting it with more force only escalates the alarm. But you can, slowly, over time, earn its trust by proving, again and again, through small moments of actual safety, that the threat it has been guarding against for so long is no longer standing at the door. The seventh and final turn is this. Self-love and letting go are not two separate practices. They are the same motion, seen from two different angles, like a single door that appears to open outward from one side of the room and inward from the other, depending on which side you happen to be standing on when you look. To love yourself fully requires letting go of every borrowed idea of who you were supposed to be. The idea handed to you by a parent who needed you to be a certain way in order to feel adequate themselves. The idea absorbed from a culture that profits enormously from your ongoing belief that you are not yet finished, not yet acceptable, not yet enough as you currently stand. The idea inherited from every relationship that only ever wanted the edited, easier, more convenient version of you. Letting go of all of this is not loss in the way loss usually feels. It does not leave you emptier. It leaves you, strangely, more whole, because everything that was cleared away was never actually load-bearing. It was only ever taking up space that belonged to something realer. And to let go fully requires, in turn, a foundation of self-love sturdy enough to survive the letting go without collapsing. You cannot release your grip on a relationship, a role, an old identity, an old story about who you had to be, unless some part of you trusts that what remains once you open your hand will still be enough to stand on. That trust is not arrogance. It is not the belief that you are better than everyone else, or that you no longer need anyone. It is the much quieter and much more durable belief that you, as you actually are, underneath every performance and every edit, are someone worth staying with, someone worth coming home to, at the end of every day that asked you to be someone else for a while. This is why so many people find that healing does not happen in a straight line, first self-love and then letting go, or first letting go and then self-love, as though they were sequential chapters in a book. It happens in a spiral, one small act of self-honesty at a time, each one making the next slightly easier, each release of an old grip making a little more room for the truer self to step forward, and each step forward making the next release feel a little less frightening than the one before it. There is no finish line to this spiral, and that is not a flaw in the process. It is simply how growth of this kind actually works. You are not trying to arrive at a permanent, unchanging state called healed. You are only trying to keep turning, gently, toward yourself, a little more honestly each time, for the rest of your life. There is one more turn worth sitting with before we let this settle into sleep, because it quietly holds all the others together, the way a single thread can run through the hem of an entire garment without ever being seen directly. It is this: you are not behind. There is no schedule you have missed, no timeline that everyone else is somehow keeping and you alone have fallen off of. This belief that there is a correct pace at which a life is supposed to unfold, that by a certain age you should have certain things settled, certain wounds healed, certain versions of yourself already achieved, is one of the most quietly cruel stories a person can carry, precisely because it feels so reasonable while you are inside it. It does not announce itself as cruelty. It announces itself as ambition, as responsibility, as simply wanting to keep up. But underneath, it is a form of self-abandonment as persistent as any of the others we have named tonight, because it asks you to measure your actual life against an imagined one that was never real to begin with, and to find the actual one lacking every single time. Think about how strange it would be to walk through a forest and criticize one tree for not yet being as tall as another, without any regard for how much shade it has had to grow through, how rocky its particular patch of soil happens to be, how many storms it has already survived that the taller tree beside it never had to face. No one walking through an actual forest does this, because it is obviously absurd the moment you say it out loud about trees. And yet we do exactly this to ourselves and to each other constantly, comparing the visible height of a life without any knowledge of the conditions it grew through, and calling the comparison motivation, when really it is just another way of teaching ourselves, once again, that we are not currently enough. There was a woman who spent her early 30s in a quiet, low-grade despair that she could never quite name, watching friends marry and buy homes and build careers that looked, from the outside, like proof of a life correctly lived, while her own life still felt unformed, still felt like it was searching for its shape. She carried a private sense of failure about this for years, a sense that she was somehow behind a race she had never agreed to enter, until a much older friend said something to her almost in passing that she never forgot. There is no version of your life happening somewhere else, running ahead of you, that you are failing to catch up to. There is only this one, unfolding at whatever pace it actually unfolds at, and the only real failure available to you is spending it convinced you should be somewhere you are not. She did not immediately feel better after hearing this, but something in her loosened, slowly, over the following months, as she began to notice how much of her exhaustion had come not from her actual circumstances, but from the constant, silent comparison running underneath them, and how much lighter her days became once she finally let that comparison go quiet. Letting go of the timeline does not mean giving up on wanting things, on working toward things, on hoping your life continues to grow and change in directions that matter to you. It only means releasing the specific and quietly punishing belief that you should already be further along than you are, that your current pace is somehow a personal failing, rather than simply the pace at which your particular life, with its particular history and its particular obstacles, happens to be moving. Trees do not apologize for growing slowly through rocky soil. They simply grow, at whatever rate the soil and the light and the seasons allow. And eventually, if you come back years later, you find they have grown into exactly the shape their particular conditions shaped them to become. And that shape, however unlike the tree beside it, is not a lesser one. It is only and completely their own. Just rest here for a moment and let this settle without argument. Wherever you currently are in your life, however far from where you once imagined you would be by now, you are not late. You are not behind. You are simply here, at exactly the point your one particular life has brought you to, and that point, however unfinished it may feel tonight, is not a mistake. It is the truth of where you actually are, and truth, however imperfect, is always a better place to stand than a comparison that was never real to begin with. If you have made it this far tonight, notice that nothing about the last several minutes has asked to fix anything. That was intentional. Because the truth is, you were never actually broken in the way you have spent so many years believing. You were shaped, by circumstances often outside your control, into someone who learned to survive by editing, performing, gripping, and disappearing whenever necessary. That shaping was not a character flaw. It was intelligence, adapting to whatever conditions it found itself in. And now, in this quiet room, in this quiet hour, you are being invited to notice that the conditions have changed, even if your patterns have not fully caught up yet, and that noticing, gentle and unhurried, is the entire beginning of everything that follows. Let your breathing slow now, if it has not already begun to slow on its own. Let your body sink a little more fully into wherever it is resting. You do not have to carry any of these 7 turns forward into tomorrow as a task to complete. You only have to let them settle, quietly, the way sediment settles at the bottom of still water, taking their time, finding their own shape in the dark. There is a version of you who has never once needed to be edited in order to be worth loving. She has been here the entire time, or he has, or they have, waiting without resentment, without impatience, for the moment you finally stopped scanning every room for danger and started, instead, scanning your own interior for a face you had almost forgotten. That face is not a stranger. It never was. It only felt that way because you had not looked in so long. You do not have to become someone new tonight. You only have to loosen your grip, just slightly, on everyone you have been pretending to be, and let what remains be enough. It has always been enough. It was enough before any of the editing began, and it is enough now, underneath everything that has been added and subtracted and rearranged in the years since. Let that be the last thought you carry into sleep tonight. Not a command, not a goal, just a quiet, simple fact, resting beside you in the dark, patient enough to still be there in the morning, whether or not you remember it arrived. And if tomorrow brings the old patterns back, the gripping, the performing, the quiet abandonment of your own needs in favor of someone else's comfort, let that be met without alarm. It does not mean tonight failed. It only means you are human, and being human means returning to old grooves sometimes, the way water finds its old paths down a hillside, even after the ground has been reshaped. What matters is not that the old patterns never return. What matters is that you now have a way of noticing them a little sooner each time, a little more gently each time, a little less convinced each time that they define the whole of who you are. That noticing, repeated patiently across many ordinary days, is the entire substance of change. It rarely arrives as a single transformation. It arrives as 1,000 small returns, each one slightly easier than the one before it, until one day, without ever announcing itself, the old pattern simply stops being the loudest voice in the room. You are allowed to move slowly through this. You are allowed to still be practicing, still be learning, still be imperfect at loving yourself for the rest of your life, because that imperfection was never the obstacle to begin with. The belief that you needed to be finished before you were allowed to rest, that was the obstacle, and you have already, simply by listening this far tonight, begun setting it down. Rest now. There is nothing left to hold on to tonight, and nothing left to prove. Only this breath, and the one after it, and the slow, unhurried return to yourself that has already, quietly, without any effort on your part, begun.